Jackson Ray sat at the sleek, polished desk in his office aboard the Daedalus, a diplomatic vessel that roamed the outer reaches of the galaxy. His fingers idly traced the holographic star map, a tool he'd become intimately familiar with during his years as an ambassador for the Coalition of Free Planets. It was peaceful here. Well, as peaceful as it could be in a galaxy on the brink of constant conflict. The Daedalus was a symbol of diplomacy and subtlety, not war. It suited Jackson. He had no desire for power, no interest in galactic politics. His focus was on treaties, alliances, and maintaining the delicate balance of peace. That was, until the message arrived. A blinking red light on his terminal pulled Jackson's attention away from the stars. He sighed, rubbing his temple, knowing it could only mean one thing: a summons. With a touch, the terminal screen flickered to life, revealing the face of an old friend, Vorian Draz, a high-ranking member of the Galactic Council. Jackson, Vorian's voice echoed through the room, his expression grave. "I didn't expect to be the one delivering this news. There's no easy way to say this, so I'll be blunt. Your father is dead." Jackson froze, his heart skipping a beat. His father, the man he'd never met, an infamous figure in galactic history. Marcus Ray, once a powerful leader, then a mysterious exile, and now a memory. "I know this must be a shock," Vorian continued, "but there's more. It's his will. The moment of his death has triggered the succession protocols within the Empire. According to the Galactic Charter, you are the rightful heir to the throne of the Nexus Empire." Jackson's stomach churned. The Nexus Empire, the very heart of galactic control. The empire his father had once tried to dismantle, only to be branded a traitor and cast aside. The throne, which had been a symbol of cruelty and oppression, now belonged to him by bloodline. "I'm no ruler, Vorian," Jackson said, his voice cold with disbelief. "I'm a diplomat, not a tyrant. My father's ideals were radical, violent. He fought against the very system that I spent my life trying to support. You must be mistaken." Vorian's face hardened. "Jackson, I wish it were a mistake, but it's not. Your father's influence is still felt across the galaxy, even in his absence. And now factions are moving. Rivals are already gathering, each one hoping to claim the throne for themselves. The Nexus Empire is on the brink of a civil war." Jackson felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't want to fight. He had spent his life building bridges, not tearing them down. Yet in this moment his destiny seemed sealed. The galaxy was a powder keg, and his father's legacy had lit the fuse. Vorian paused before continuing, his voice softening. "The Coalition needs you, Jackson. The galaxy needs you. You can't hide from this. Not anymore." Jackson leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought of Earth, his home, a distant, fragile planet that had never held much sway over the politics of the stars. He had never sought greatness, never wanted power. But it seemed as though the galaxy had other plans for him, whether he wanted it or not. The weight of the universe was now on his shoulders. Jackson's mind spun as the call ended, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. His fingers hovered over the terminal screen, but he couldn't bring himself to initiate anything. The weight of the news pressed down on him, suffocating. His father, Marcus Ray, had been both a hero and a pariah. To some, he was a liberator, an idealistic visionary willing to sacrifice everything for a better future. To others, he was a tyrant in disguise, a man who tried to destroy the very empire that held the galaxy together. And now Jackson, the son of this man, was supposed to inherit the throne. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on his door. "Enter," Jackson called, his voice hollow. The door slid open, revealing his closest confidant, Irinder, a towering figure with dark, scared skin. Irinder was a warrior-turned-diplomat, a living symbol of the diverse coalition Jackson had helped to build. His presence alone was enough to command attention, but the look on his face told Jackson everything he needed to know. The time for contemplation was over. Jackson, it's happening. The Empire's factions are already making their move, Erinder said, his voice low and urgent. The assassination attempts on you, they were no accident. They've learned of your bloodline. Jackson's stomach turned. He had suspected something was off, but now it was confirmed. Whoever controlled the throne controlled the galaxy. If someone wanted to eliminate him, they were clearly willing to do whatever it took. Who's behind it? Jackson asked, his mind working through the possibilities. Was it Lord Vastra, the name that had haunted his father's final years, or perhaps someone closer to home? It's not just one group, Erinder replied, stepping closer. It's a coalition of old loyalists, opportunists, and those who believe the Empire needs a strong, unyielding hand. They'll stop at nothing to see you fail. But that's not the real danger. He paused, letting the tension hang in the air. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. What's the real danger? Vastra, Erinder said, his eyes narrowing. Lord Vastra has been waiting for this moment. He believes that the only way to bring true order to the galaxy is through total control. He's an ancient force, ruthless and cunning, and he has no qualms about wiping out anyone who stands in his way. Jackson's hands clenched into fists. Lord Vastra. The name sent a shiver down his spine. His father had fought against him, and Vastra's forces had been the ones responsible for his disappearance all those years ago. He had assumed Vastra was long dead, but it seemed the galaxy had other plans. How do you know this? Jackson asked, his voice hardening. Erinder looked away for a moment, clearly conflicted. I was once one of his captains. I left because I could no longer stomach his methods. He believes humanity is a weakness in the Galactic Order, something to be eradicated, not embraced. He knows you are the Heir, Jackson, and he wants you gone. Jackson swallowed hard. He wasn't prepared for this. He had always thought of himself as an observer, an outsider to the conflicts of the galaxy. But now, the battles were coming for him. His father's legacy was a double-edged sword, and Jackson was caught on the wrong side of it. We don't have much time, Erinder continued. The longer you delay, the stronger his forces will become. It's time to make a decision. You need to act. Jackson looked out the window, the stars stretching endlessly before him. This was no longer about diplomacy. It was about survival. His father's dream of a unified galaxy was slipping further away, and now it was up to him to determine if that dream would die, or if he would fight for it. I'll do it, Jackson said, his voice firm. I won't let the Empire fall into the hands of men like Vastra. I don't want the throne, but if it's the only way to stop him, then I'll take it. Erinder nodded solemnly. Then it begins. Prepare yourself, Jackson. The road ahead will be harder than anything you've ever faced. Jackson's hands trembled, but his resolve solidified. He had made his choice. The galaxy would learn that humanity, no matter how reluctant, was not to be underestimated. Jackson stood before the doors of the Daedalus launch bay, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Erinder had insisted he leave the safety of the ship and travel to a remote world, a harsh, untamed planet known as Korthak, where the galaxy's most battle-hardened warriors were forged. If Jackson was to lead the galaxy, he would need more than diplomacy and charisma. He would need strength, cunning, and the ability to command respect through action. Korthak was the perfect place to cultivate those skills. But Jackson had never been a fighter. He had always used words, not weapons, to change the galaxy. Yet, as the time to leave drew closer, Jackson realized that his old ways would not be enough to face what lay ahead. The Daedalus engines hummed to life, and the ship began its descent through the atmosphere of Korthak, a world known for its savage landscapes and even more savage inhabitants. The surface was barren and unforgiving, the sky perpetually streaked with dust storms. Here, in this brutal environment, only the strongest survived, and Jackson's survival was anything but certain. Upon landing, a small group of Korthak's native warriors awaited them, led by Zara Kale, the exiled princess who had once ruled an empire of her own. Zara had spent years on Korthak honing her skills as a warrior, and she had agreed to train Jackson, though not without her doubts. Jackson could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe he had what it took. He couldn't blame her. He didn't believe it either. "Your father's reputation precedes you," Zara said curtly as she sized him up, her dark eyes unreadable. "I don't care who your father was. If you want to survive here, you will earn it." Jackson swallowed, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. "I don't need to be a warrior. I need to lead." Zara's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "Leadership isn't given, Jackson. It's taken. You can't lead people if you don't understand the cost of sacrifice. I'll show you how to survive in this hell, but if you can't endure the pain, you won't last 5 minutes." She led him through the rugged terrain of Korthak, putting him through brutal physical tests that pushed him to the limits of exhaustion. His body screamed in protest, every step an effort, every breath a battle. There were no shortcuts, no mercy. But Jackson was determined. He had no choice. He couldn't afford to fail. Each lesson was harder than the last. Climbing jagged cliffs, wrestling massive wild beasts, and navigating treacherous ravines filled with deadly predators. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Jackson was covered in bruises, his muscles aching beyond belief. He had fallen countless times, but each time he had pushed himself to get up. In the cold night air, as they camped under the stars, Zara sat beside him, a rare moment of stillness between them. "You're not the first to come here with a noble cause, Jackson," Zara said quietly, her voice softer than it had been all day. "But most of them didn't survive. The galaxy is full of ideals, but ideals don't fight. People like Vastra. They don't care about your cause. They only care about power." Jackson glanced at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But if I don't do this, then who will? I can't let people like Vastra tear the galaxy apart. It's not just my fight. It's everyone's." Zara nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars above. "You're learning, but you have a long way to go." Jackson lay back on the rocky ground, staring up at the endless sky, and for the first time since he received the news of his inheritance, something inside him shifted. The galaxy, with all its complexities and dangers, no longer felt like an insurmountable challenge. He had been given a chance, a rare chance to change the course of history. He would make it count, no matter what it took. The days on Korthak blurred into a brutal rhythm. Jackson's body had hardened, his once limp frame now sturdy and capable, though the toll on his mind was undeniable. Zara had pushed him past his limits, forcing him to face his weaknesses with relentless training. Every day, Jackson grew stronger, but he was no closer to understanding what kind of leader he was supposed to be. He had learned to fight, yes, but the question of why he was fighting loomed larger than ever. One evening, as the twin moons of Korthak hung low in the sky, Zara called Jackson to a campfire, her face serious in the flickering light. "You've been through the trials," she said, her tone low and deliberate. "You've learned what it means to survive in the wild. But there's one more lesson, Jackson. One that no warrior can teach you. It's something you'll have to learn on your own." Jackson felt his heart sink. He had endured the physical trials, but he knew Zara wasn't talking about brute strength. She was talking about something far more dangerous. Leadership. "I'm ready," he said, though doubt crept into his voice. He had never wanted power, never wanted to lead. But now it seemed inevitable. The galaxy was in turmoil, and if he didn't step up, who would? Zara regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "There's more to your father's legacy than you know. His rebellion wasn't just about freeing the oppressed. It was about challenging the system that had corrupted everything. He made enemies, Jackson. Powerful enemies. And they'll stop at nothing to ensure you fail." Jackson nodded, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had heard rumors of his father's rebellion, of his radical ideals and his brutal methods, but the full extent of the threat had never felt so real. His father had been a revolutionary, a symbol of resistance. But Jackson had no desire to follow in his footsteps. His father's enemies, the people who had destroyed his life, were now hunting him. A shadow passed over the fire, and Jackson's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, but Zara's calm voice stopped him. "You don't need that," she said quietly. "The real danger isn't out here. It's closer than you think." Jackson's gaze narrowed. "What do you mean?" Zara stood, her eyes searching the horizon. "There's a traitor among your people, someone you trust." Jackson's pulse quickened. A traitor? But who? He had left behind only a small circle of trusted allies, and yet he could feel it, like a crack in the foundation of his resolve. Who could have betrayed him? "Vorian," Jackson said slowly, the name slipping from his lips before he could stop it. "It has to be Vorian." Zara shook her head. "It's not him. He's loyal, more than you know. But there's someone else, someone you never suspected." Jackson clenched his fists, fighting back the surge of anger. His father's legacy was not just a burden, it was a ticking time bomb, one that could destroy everything he had fought for. Every decision he made, every person he trusted, was a gamble. The next morning, as they packed up camp, Jackson's communicator buzzed. A message from the Daedalus. His heart skipped a beat as he read the urgent transmission. An assassination attempt had been made on his life, and the attack had been traced back to his own fleet. Someone within his ranks was working with Vastra's agents. "Damn it," Jackson muttered, his blood turning cold. "They found me." Zara didn't flinch. "We need to go back, Jackson. You're running out of time." Jackson's mind raced. He had known it was coming, but now the betrayal was undeniable. Someone close to him, was using his father's legacy against him, setting him up for failure. He had to return to the heart of the storm, face the traitor in his midst, and confront the fact that the very people he trusted were the ones conspiring to destroy him. "You're right," Jackson said, his voice low with resolve. "It's time to stop running. The real battle starts now." Jackson's return to the Daedalus was swift, and as the sleek vessel pierced the upper atmosphere of Korthak, the weight of what he was about to face settled heavily on his shoulders. Every inch of him wanted to turn back, to hide away on the remote world where no one could find him, but there was no escaping this. Not anymore. The traitor was within his ranks, and the galaxy was on the verge of tearing itself apart. Jackson had never chosen to be part of this war. He had never wanted to sit on a throne, never wanted the responsibility that came with ruling. But it seemed that fate had other plans. As the Daedalus returned to its orbiting station, Jackson met with Erinder in the command center, his expression unreadable. The warrior-turned-diplomat looked grim, as always, but now there was an edge to his demeanor, a silent understanding that the stakes had just gotten higher. "Erinder, I need your help," Jackson said, his voice steady but heavy. "There's a traitor among us. Someone within the crew is working with Vastra's agents. We need to find out who, and fast." Erinder's eyes narrowed, but he didn't question. "We'll search the ship, interrogate the crew, but it won't be enough. The traitor is too close, Jackson. They'll know what we're doing before we even start." Jackson grimaced. He knew Erinder was right. Whoever the betrayer was, they had already made their move. They had to be someone who could manipulate the ship's systems, who had the trust of the crew. It was a chilling realization. Someone he had worked with, laughed with, trusted. "Then we'll have to outsmart them," Jackson said, turning to face the large view screen that displayed the stars stretching before them. "I need to know who benefits from my failure. Who wants me dead?" Erinder thought for a moment before speaking. "Lord Vastra. He's already mobilizing his forces. The timing is perfect. If you die, the throne will fall into his hands, and the empire will be his to control. But he wouldn't risk his own people being caught in the act, Not if he can avoid it. Jackson nodded slowly. But someone inside the coalition. Someone close to me. They think they can control the future. They don't realize they're playing a game they can't win. It was clear now. The traitor was someone within his inner circle. Someone who had deep access to coalition assets and knew exactly how to navigate the political undercurrents of the galaxy. The very thought made Jackson sick to his stomach. He had spent years building a network of alliances, carefully crafting a coalition that spanned the galaxy's disparate factions, but one person's greed or ambition could destroy it all. "We need to move fast," Erinder said, his voice low but urgent. "I'll gather the command staff. You need to start thinking about who's close enough to have the means and the motive." Jackson nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. There were a few faces that immediately came to mind. Talon Ver, his chief strategist, known for his ambition but with an unshakable loyalty to the cause. Rhea Solis, the commanding officer of the Daedalus, a brilliant tactician, but with a personal history that had always raised Jackson's suspicions. Then there was Vorian Draz, the old friend who had brought him the news of his father's death, who had helped him understand the political landscape of the galaxy. But Jackson had never truly trusted him. There was something hidden beneath Vorian's calculated politeness, a sense that the man's loyalty was as much to himself as it was to the coalition. As Jackson made his way through the corridors of the Daedalus, the cold, sterile walls seemed to close in on him. Every shadow, every creak of the ship's hull, made him question his every decision. His father's empire was rising again, and the galaxy was watching. Every moment he spent wondering about the traitor was one more moment that Vastra's agents had to move against him. In the main briefing room, Erinder was already assembling the command staff, their faces somber as Jackson entered. He took a deep breath, pushing down the anxiety that threatened to consume him. He had to lead now. He had to act decisively. "We're facing a crisis," Jackson began, his voice firm. "There's a traitor in our midst, working with Vastra's people. We need to root them out, and we need to do it quickly. Everyone here is a suspect, but only one person can be responsible." He paused, scanning the room, his eyes locking with each member of the staff. The tension was palpable. Find them, before it's too late. The search for the traitor was a tense, silent affair. The corridors of the Daedalus felt more like a maze now, each corner holding the potential for betrayal, every seemingly innocent face a mask. Jackson had gathered his closest allies, but the walls between them had thickened. Who could he trust? Erinder had told him that loyalty could be a rare commodity in times like these, and Jackson understood that more with every passing hour. "Do we have any leads?" Jackson asked as he stood in front of the command table, his voice sharp. The room was dimly lit, shadows creeping along the edges, as though the very ship itself was conspiring against them. Erinder's face was unreadable as he looked over the intelligence gathered so far. "We've been combing through the ship's logs, communications, and personnel movements. Whoever is behind this knows how to cover their tracks. But we did find something interesting. There was a message sent through a secure channel, disguised as routine fleet orders. It was only flagged because of the encryption signature. It matches a known Vastra contact." Jackson's stomach churned. A secure channel, hidden beneath the layers of bureaucracy and communication noise. It was as though the traitor had known exactly how to slip under the radar, making it clear that this was no ordinary betrayal. "And the message?" Jackson asked, a knot forming in his chest. Erinder hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. It was brief, but it was a warning. "The time is near. Prepare for the inevitable." That's all it said. "The inevitable," Jackson echoed, his voice low. The words echoed in his mind, a whisper from the past. Vastra had always talked like that. His philosophy was one of cold inevitability, believing that control, absolute control, was the only way to bring order to the galaxy. "What does this mean?" Jackson asked, trying to steady his mind. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but they didn't make a coherent picture just yet. Erinder's brow furrowed. It means the traitor is working with Vastra's people, and it's more than just sabotage. Whoever is involved has been playing a long game. Jackson turned away from the table, his eyes drifting to the window that offered a view of the galaxy beyond. The cold emptiness of space seemed to mock him now. How many battles had been fought for this moment? How many lives had been lost? His father's rebellion, his fight to change the system, had always seemed like an idealistic dream, a dream he never wanted to inherit. But now, that dream was his burden to bear, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. "It's not just the ship, is it?" Jackson murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "The traitor, they're part of something bigger, something deeper." Erindor's eyes narrowed. "You're saying this is more than a rogue agent?" Jackson turned back to him, his voice steady but resolute. "Yes, this is a faction within the coalition. There are people, members of my father's old allies, who think I'm weak. They think they can use me or replace me, or worse, control me. They see Vastra as a necessary force, someone who can restore order." "The rebels who sided with your father," Erindor said slowly, piecing it together. "They never stopped fighting. Some of them never believed in your vision. They believe the galaxy needs a firm hand, and if they can't control you, they'll try to control your legacy." Jackson's jaw clenched, a wave of anger and frustration crashing over him. His father's legacy was a double-edged sword. His ideals had given rise to a movement that had shaken the galaxy to its core. But now that same movement had splintered, torn apart by ambition, greed, and the desire for power. He had thought he was the heir to a revolution, but he was realizing now that the true inheritance was one of chaos and bloodshed. "We need to act," Jackson said, his voice hardening. "We have to find the traitor before they make their move. I don't care who it is. It ends now." Erindor nodded, but there was something in his eyes, an understanding that Jackson had not yet fully grasped the depth of the fight ahead. The coalition had been fractured from the beginning. It was never just about the throne. It was about control over the future. And Jackson had just realized that to protect it, he might have to destroy the very thing he had spent his life trying to build. In that moment, Jackson understood the cost of power. The price was not just his life, but the very soul of the galaxy. And there was no going back. The corridors of the Daedalus felt colder than ever as Jackson made his way to the command center. The walls seemed to press in on him, suffocating with the weight of the choices he had to make. Each step he took echoed louder in his mind, a reminder that he was running out of time. The traitor was no longer a shadow in the distance. They were here, inside his ship, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Erindor had gathered a small group of his most trusted officers to conduct a sweep of the ship's lower decks, but Jackson knew that their efforts would be in vain unless they found the leak in their ranks. The traitor was someone with access to the highest levels of command, someone who knew their every move, every plan. "Do you trust anyone here?" Erindor had asked him earlier, his voice laced with a level of concern Jackson had never heard before. Jackson's answer had been a hard silence. He didn't know who to trust anymore. There was too much at stake, and too many people with their own agendas. If he failed, the galaxy would be plunged into chaos, and the name of his father would be nothing more than a hollow echo in the history books. Now, standing before the command center, he felt the weight of that failure press down on him once again. He had come so far, survived so much. But this was different. This wasn't about diplomacy or battle strategies. This was about loyalty, about trust, and if that foundation crumbled, nothing else would matter. The doors slid open with a hiss, and Jackson stepped inside. His senior officers, including Talon Var and Rhea Solis, were already seated, their faces grim. "We've gathered intel from every department, Jackson," Rhea said, her tone firm but respectful. "But there's something we missed. We overlooked a transmission that was sent from one of the lower decks 2 days ago, just after we arrived in Korthak's orbit. It was disguised as a routine fleet update, but it was sent to a secure address known only to Vastra's agents. Jackson's blood ran cold. Another encrypted message. And now, a pattern was emerging. Who could have done this? He asked, his voice strained. Someone close to me. Someone in this room. Talon Ver, his chief strategist, met his gaze. We all have our secrets, Jackson, but no one here would betray you. Jackson clenched his fists. How can you be so sure? Rhea's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of doubt in her gaze. We've all sworn loyalty to you, but loyalty has a price. Some of us might be willing to pay it to secure our own futures. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. The implications of what Rhea had said were clear. Each of them was on the precipice of a dangerous decision. Loyalty was no longer just a matter of principle. It had become a currency, one that could be traded for power, for survival, or for the chance to carve out their own future in the chaos that was to come. You're all looking for someone to blame, Jackson said, his voice cutting through the tension. But it's not enough to find the traitor. We need to understand why this is happening. We need to understand who benefits from my downfall. Talon's eyes softened. I think we already know, Jackson. Vastra wants to destroy the coalition, tear apart your father's vision. He's already moving his forces into position. We're running out of time. The room went silent, the weight of their words sinking in. Jackson was standing on the edge of a precipice. Vastra's forces were gathering, and the traitor within their ranks was only a small part of the larger scheme. He had been a pawn in his father's war, but now he was playing a game of his own, a game where the stakes were higher than ever. Then we prepare for war, Jackson said, his voice steady, though his insides churned with uncertainty. We fight back. We find the traitor, we stop Vastra, and we secure the future my father died for. Rhea shook her head. We can't afford to make mistakes, Jackson. Every decision you make will determine whether we win or lose. I know, Jackson said quietly, his gaze sweeping over his officers. But we don't have the luxury of time. If we don't move now, there will be no future to fight for. He turned to leave, but before the doors closed behind him, Talon spoke again, his voice low and heavy with meaning. Jackson, remember one thing, he said. When you make your move, make sure you know who you're fighting for. Jackson paused. For a moment, he wasn't sure if Talon's words were a warning or a reminder. But as he walked away, the weight of it lingered. The stakes had never been higher, and the cost of failure was unimaginable. Jackson stood on the command deck of the Daedalus, watching as the vast expanse of space stretched out before him. The stars seemed so far away, distant and cold, their light barely piercing the darkness of the void. But the battle ahead, an internal war within his very ranks, was closing in on him with terrifying speed. His father's rebellion, once a symbol of hope, had been twisted into a maelstrom of betrayal and ambition. He had thought he could change the galaxy, build something better, but now all he had were fractured alliances and enemies at every turn. We've traced the traitor's movements, Erindur said, his voice heavy with urgency. They'd been using the Daedalus as their base of operations, coordinating with Vastra's forces. The transmission we intercepted, it was a signal to deploy their troops. Jackson's heart sank. Then the traitor has already made their move. The fleet is compromised. Rhea, standing beside him, nodded grimly. There's no time left to waste. If we don't act now, the rest of the fleet will fall under Vastra's control. And with the traitor among us, it's only a matter of time before the Daedalus is lost. Jackson's mind raced. They had to find the traitor, but the task had become far more complicated than a simple betrayal. The real enemy, the one pulling the strings, was Vastra. He had orchestrated this entire charade to destroy Jackson and his vision for the galaxy. But the traitor in their midst had given Vastra the key to breaking everything Jackson had worked for. I know who it is, Jackson said suddenly, his voice low and certain. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. It's Vorian, he declared, his voice like steel. Rhea's face went pale. Vorian? Are you sure? Jackson nodded, his eyes hard. He was the one who brought me the news of my father's death. He's always been there, always in the background. And now I see it. He's been manipulating me from the start, using my desire to bring unity as a weapon. Arinder clenched his fists. Then we have no choice. We confront him now. They didn't wait. A small team of trusted soldiers, led by Arinder, made their way to Vorian's quarters. Jackson stayed behind, watching as the pieces of his empire came crashing down. He felt a deep, gnawing regret. His father had never been able to achieve true peace because of men like Vorian, people who thought the galaxy could only be ruled through force. And now, Jackson was paying the price. Minutes later, a message came through the ship's comms system. Vorian had been taken into custody. Jackson rushed to the break, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the cold, sterile cell, stood Vorian, his arms crossed and a look of resigned defeat on his face. He wasn't surprised. He hadn't fought back when they came for him. Instead, he simply stood there, watching Jackson approach. I knew it would come to this, Vorian said, his voice calm, almost amused. You were always too idealistic, Jackson. Too naive. You couldn't see it. How the galaxy works. Power doesn't come from unity or peace. It comes from control. And I was always the one who truly understood that. Jackson's fists clenched, rage rising in his throat. You betrayed me, Vorian. You betrayed my father's vision. Vorian smirked. Your father's vision was flawed from the start. You, Jackson, you were never meant to lead. You were a puppet, a figurehead for my own plans. I thought I could control you, but you've proved to be far more troublesome than I anticipated. Jackson stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. This ends now. You've underestimated me, just like everyone else. Without warning, Jackson turned and left the break, his mind swirling with the consequences of his actions. Vorian's betrayal had been a calculated move, one that threatened everything he had built. But the confrontation had only confirmed one thing. Jackson was the true heir of his father's revolution, and no one, not even Vorian, could take that from him. Back on the command deck, Arinder was waiting, his expression one of grim resolve. Vorian's taken care of, Jackson said, his voice steady. But there's still Vastra to deal with. Arinder nodded. The fleet's ready. We launch at your command. Jackson looked out at the stars one last time. It was time to stop running, to stop hiding behind the legacy of his father. The war wasn't just about vengeance or power. It was about shaping the future of the galaxy. And Jackson was the one who would lead them into it. We move out, Jackson said, his voice unwavering. The time for peace is over. We fight for a future of our own making. The Daedalus leaped into action, its engines roaring to life as the fleet followed suit. Jackson's heart beat with the rhythm of war, knowing that the fate of the galaxy rested in his hands. The battle for the future was about to begin. And this time, Jackson would be the one to decide how it ended.